All right, so we're going to be looking at chapter 12 with nervous tissue today. We're going to be doing this in two different parts where we're going to focus mostly on the structural organization and kind of how an action potential is formed, and then we'll talk a little bit later about the electrical signals and the different types of synapses that are present when we look at number 2. So 2 body systems that help control and integrate all body activities are going to be your nervous system and your endocrine system. So your nervous system and your hormones are going to work together in order to control and keep your body at homeostasis. Now, neurology is the branch of medical science that deals specifically with the nervous system. Now, the nervous system serves 3 basic functions. They relate to the maintenance of internal balance that we would call homeostasis. All right, so they have these 3 functions, and again, to help with homeostasis. We see the first is that they're going to sense changes. These changes can be both inside or outside of the body, and this is going to be the sensory information. Like you see here in the picture, it's marked with the blue. We then see there's got to be an interpretation of this type of stimulus or the change that's taken place. This is called the integrative function. We then have the reacting to these changes. This is caused by muscle contractions or glandular secretions, and this is the motor function. Now, this is determined by the integrative system to decide what needs to be done based on the stimulus that was provided. So the structural organization of the nervous system is going to be into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, your central nervous system, also known as your CNS, is going to be composed of your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is going to be composed of your cranial and spinal nerves, the ganglia, and sensory receptors. Now, these sensory receptors will be talked about later in Anatomy 2, where we're going to focus in on the general senses and then also the special senses. When we look at this, we see that they are still part of the sensory receptors, and they are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. So functional organization, though, of the nervous system is we're going to see that there's going to be where information is going to be put in to the system. This is the sensory information. We then see it's going to travel up through the integrated system, through the central nervous system of the spinal cord to the brain. We then see information is going to come back down, and we then should see a motor output or the command that comes out of this. The integrative function is going to be done by the central nervous system. This is going to interpret the sensory information and then also generate a response. However, the peripheral nervous system is going to provide the sensory information, and it's also going to allow for the motor function to take place. Now, the sensory component is known as the afferent or incoming information. These are known as the afferent pathways going up into the brain. These contain many different receptors which detect a type of change. Now, remember, these receptors could be general receptors like touch, pain, tickle, itch, that sort of thing, or they could be very specific sense receptors like for your vision, your smell, taste, hearing, and balance. The efferent or outgoing pathway. This is going to conduct the impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles or glands to make a response. Now, the peripheral nervous system has 3 subdivisions. We see that there is going to be the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the voluntary and conscious control that we have of our body. So this is going to mostly deal with your skeletal muscles. The sensory neurons are going to conduct impulses from your cutaneous and special sensory receptors to your central nervous system. So your cutaneous, if you recall, will deal mostly with your skin. The motor neurons are going to send impulses from the central nervous system, and they're going to talk specifically to the skeletal muscles. So this is what the somatic nervous system is going to focus in on, talking to the skeletal muscles for voluntary conscious control. The peripheral nervous system is also subdivided into the autonomic nervous system. So this is the second part. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, this is the involuntary or unconscious control. Now, this one can actually be subdivided even more, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we see here that the sensory neurons are going to conduct impulses to the central nervous system. In this case, the motor neurons are going to send impulses from the central nervous system now to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. It's not going to talk to the skeletal muscles. Again, this is the involuntary unconscious control that you're not quite aware of. We see that this is going to be discussed more in chapter 15, where the autonomic nervous system is actually divided into the sympathetic nervous system, known as the combat or fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic, which is also termed as the rest and digest. The last division that we see that is part of the peripheral nervous system is what we call the enteric nervous system. This is closely related to the autonomic nervous system in the sense that it is involuntary. It is also going to communicate with smooth muscle and glands, but these muscles and glands are going to be specifically servicing the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so these are going to be specifically talking to the digestive type system, talking about the stomach, the intestines, small and large, that sort of thing. And so they get kind of a special group kind of subdivided out of that autonomic nervous system. So this is called the enteric nervous system. All right, so now let's talk about the nervous tissue and what makes up the nervous tissue. Now there are two specialized cells that are part of the nervous tissue. They are the neurons and the neuroglia. Now the neuron is actually known as the nerve cell, and it has three components to it. It has what we would call the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. Now this connection between the cell body and the axon is known as the hillock or the trigger zone. Okay, we also see at the very end of the axon there's going to be what we call the axon terminal. That means the end. So guys, when we look here, the cell body is also known as the soma. It's going to contain the cytoplasm, nucleus, and various organelles. The nissl body is going to be where we see that it has the rough ER, which is going to produce specific proteins for growth and repair. The hillock is where the soma is going to connect to the axon. This is where action potentials, which we'll talk about later, are going to be generated. The dendrites are the nerve fibers that receive input information and conduct it towards the cell body. Okay, this is kind of be the areas that are filling out and receiving information that then the cell body of the neuron is going to determine whether or not we need to send a signal. These are going to be non-myelinated, which we'll talk more about what myelin is later, and they're going to be shorter and highly branched processes. On the other hand, the axon is the nerve fiber that conducts impulses away from the cell body. This is going to then talk to either another neuron or an effector known as a muscle or gland. We see that the axon is going to be long, thin, and it's going to be a cylindrical projection that may be short. Okay, especially in the central nervous system because communication is very close, or it can be long, like meters long in the peripheral nervous system, like talk about the nerve that runs from your spinal cord down to your big toe. It's going to be a long nerve. We see that these can be myelinated, but they may not be. So guys, a nerve is actually a bundle of nerve fibers that take place in there, or that are present within the peripheral nervous system. This is going to be where there is the actual axons bundled together with connective tissue in between. If you'll notice in this picture, this is very similar to how muscles are packaged. Okay, the muscles, remember, were packaged where they were wrapped several times around for protection. The same thing here when we're talking about the nerve in the peripheral nervous system. We do see that there's going to be the endoneurium, which is going to go around individual axons. We then see a bundle of axons together are going to be packaged with the perineurium. And then we see the entire nerve is going to be wrapped with the epineurium. Okay, so we see that there's that wrapping that is present. Now these nerves are divided into different pairs or groups. We see that the cranial nerves, you have 12 pairs of them, and they are all focused here within the head. So there's 24 total. We see that the spinal nerves are going to be below the neck. We see that you have 31 pairs for a total of 62. When we look at these nerves, talking about cranial nerves and spinal nerves, most of them are going to be what we call mixed nerves. Mixed nerves mean that they contain both sensory and motor nerve fibers. Some that we will see in the cranial nerves are going to be sensory only or motor only, but for the most part, most of our nerves are going to be mixed. Now, in the central nervous system, there's no connective tissue between the nerve fibers that are bundled. Therefore, these bundles are going to be known as tracts instead of nerves. So when we talk about the central nervous system, a bundle of axons are a tract, but in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of axons is known as a nerve. So some other terms that are also important that are different between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system are clusters of the cell bodies. A cluster of neural cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are known as ganglia, which you can see here in this picture, whereas a cluster of neural cell bodies in the central nervous system is known as a nuclei. You can see it here also in the picture of the brain. All right, so there is that difference. So here's a little chart. We talked about this neuron structure, bundle of axon fibers, and a group of cell bodies. They have different names based on if it's peripheral nervous system or central nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of axons is known as a nerve. In the central nervous system, it's known as a tract. In the peripheral nervous system, a group of cell bodies is known as a ganglia, whereas a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system are known as nuclei. All right, so make sure that you keep these terms separated with the peripheral and the central nervous system. Now, neurons connect all regions of your body to your brain and your spinal cord. Neurons have lost the ability to undergo mitosis, so therefore they can't be replaced. Neurons can be classified by their structure or their function. So when we look at structural classification, this is based on the number of processes that extend from the cell body itself. So when we look at this first picture, this is called a multipolar neuron because of the fact that it has one axon and many dendrites coming off of the cell body. So we would call this multipolar. In the next one, though, there's only two projections coming off of the cell body. There's one axon and one main dendrite. Now, these dendrites do flare out and branch later, but connected to the cell body, there's only one. So this is known as a bipolar neuron. This last one only has one projection that's coming off of the cell body, and so this is known as a unipolar. This is going to be where the axon and dendrite are fused, and there's one process that connects this to the cell body. All right, so I have a picture here that's showing you number 1 is a sensory neuron. We see number 2 is the interneuron, and number 3 is a motor neuron. So what type of neuron is the motor neuron? So if we take a look at this motor neuron at number 3, how many projections are coming off of the cell body? Well, in this case, there's many projections, so this would be multipolar. Then the next question is what type of neuron is an interneuron? The interneuron here is number 2. Again, there's many projections coming off, so it is multipolar as well. So multipolar neurons are going to be mostly motor neurons and interneurons, and they're going to be located both in the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Now, bipolar neurons are actually the least common neuron in our body, and these are going to be associated with your special sensory neurons, especially for smell, like for olfaction. For seeing, which you can see here in this picture, it's showing you a little picture a little close-up of the retina of the eye, and you can see the bipolar cells that are present there, and also in your ears for hearing. So these are going to be located in your special sense organs. Now, what type of neuron is the sensory neuron that we see here in this picture? If we see here, there's only one projection coming off of the cell body, therefore this is a unipolar neuron. Now, unipolar neurons are going to be for your generalized sensory neurons in your peripheral nervous systems. They're going to detect things like touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Now, there's also functional classifications. This is based on the direction that they send their impulse or their action potential in relation to the central nervous system. So when we look here, the sensory or afferent neurons are going to be the ones who conduct information to the central nervous system, towards the central nervous system. They do this via cranial or spinal nerves. Most of these are going to be unipolar. We see that the efferent are going to be the motor neurons. They're going to conduct impulses away from the central nervous system to effectors like muscles and glands. They are also going to use the cranial and spinal nerves to do this, because remember, cranial and spinal nerves, most of them are going to be what we would consider mixed. They have fibers that are going to be afferent, and they have fibers that are going to be efferent. We see that the interneurons are the association neurons, and these are actually found inside of the central nervous system. And most of these neurons are also going to be multipolar. So if you'll notice, we made the connection with the structural side along with some of the functional as well. All right, so we have a little area here that says name that neuron. If we take a look here at the top neuron, this is going to be a unipolar neuron. Remember, unipolar neurons are going to normally be sensory neurons, as well as the fact that it is going towards the central nervous system. So this would be a sensory nerve. We also see then here in the yellow that this neuron is in the actual central nervous system, the brain or spinal cord, therefore that is an interneuron. And then we see that the blue neuron down here is taking information away from the central nervous system, and it is also multipolar, which is going to make it a motor neuron. All right, so we can see that this is how the information is going to be carried. It's going to be picked up by the sensory neuron, taken to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is going to interpret it and decide what needs to be done and send the motor impulse out through the motor neuron. Now, there are two specialized types of cells. Well, we just talked about mostly the neuron. When we look at the neuron, guys, one thing I want to note on that is that it kind of resembles your hand. When you take a look here, you have the dendrites, you have the cell body, and you have the axon like your forearm. Now, this neuron cannot survive on its own. It needs these other special cells in order to help. These are known as neuroglia or glial cells. They're the support cells for the neuron. They help keep the neuron healthy. They help nourish it, take care of it in order to help keep it functional. These are smaller and more numerous than the neurons. They are capable normally of cell division, but they do not actually send action potentials like the neuron does. They're not electrically excitable. There are several types of neuroglial cells that are found specifically in the central nervous system, so your brain or spinal cord. These star-shaped cells with many processes in the central nervous system are known as astrocytes. These are going to metabolize neurotransmitters, maintain potassium balances in your central nervous system, as well as help form a blood-brain barrier. These are going to serve as a link between your neurons and your blood vessels. Okay, so they kind of act as like the cupbearer to the neuron. Remember, the cupbearer for the king was the one who actually tasted the food or the drink before it went to the king, and that way if it was poisoned, it killed him instead of the king. This is because it's easier to replace the cupbearer than it is to replace a king. The same thing here. We cannot replace the neuron, but we can replace the astrocytes. So they are going to help kind of monitor what is being given to the actual neurons. The next one are called the oligodendrocytes. The oligodendrocytes are going to look like astrocytes, but they're normally smaller. These are going to form a network around the axons of the central nervous system neurons, and they are going to produce a special type of covering for the axons that we call a myelin sheath. This myelin is a lipoprotein, and it's going to help support and allow for conduction of those electrical signals to take place. We also see that there's the microglia. The microglia are going to be phagocytic cells. They're going to clean up and protect the area of the brain, because if you'll recall, we don't have any blood coming in direct contact with the brain tissue or the spinal cord tissue, and so because of that, there's not a lot of white blood cells that are present, so the microglia will help with the whole idea of protection and cleanup. The last type of special neuroglial cells that are found in the central nervous system are what we call the epithelial cells. The epithelial cells are simple cuboidal or columnar epithelial cells. So if you recall, that means there's one layer of either cube or column shaped cells. These may be ciliated, like you can see down here in the picture, and they are going to line the brain ventricles and also the central canal of the spinal cord, and they are going to help produce cerebral spinal fluid. Now, cerebral spinal fluid is important because it's actually going to be what your brain and your spinal cord is like floating in. It's going to help nourish those neurons, but it's also going to help protect them from and absorb shock and things like that. So like when you run or you move your head from side to side, your brain's not just hitting the sides of your skull, it's floating in that fluid. And this fluid is created by those epithelial cells. Now, there are two types of neuroglial cells that are going to be special in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, in the peripheral nervous system, we see that there are the Schwann cells. The Schwann cells, guys, are going to act very similar to the oligodendrocytes. These are also known as neural lymphocytes. These are going to be flat cells that wrap around the axon of the peripheral nervous system, and they're going to produce that myelin sheath similar to what the oligodendrocytes do in the central nervous system. We also see that there's going to be the satellite cells in the peripheral nervous system. These are flat cells that are going to go around the cell body of the neurons. These are going to regulate exchange of materials, and so again, they're going to act a lot like the astrocytes do in the central nervous system. So guys, this chart just gives you a brief overview when we look here of the peripheral nervous system as well as the central nervous system. These are the neuroglia. In the purple, you'll see that there are the four types for the central nervous system: the oligodendrocytes, the astrocytes, the microglia, and the epithelial cells. In the peripheral nervous system, there are two special neuroglia. There are the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. Now, there are two types of the neuroglial cells that are responsible for the myelin that goes around the axons. These are going to be the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system and the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. These are going to form the myelin sheath on more than one axon in the central nervous system with the oligodendrocytes. These are non-regenerative, so they do not have the ability to be reproduced. They produce the myelination, which forms the white matter, whereas the areas that are unmyelinated, like the cell bodies and the dendrites, are going to be called the gray matter. On the Schwann cells, they are going to form the myelin sheath for up to 100 layers on an axon. This is going to aid in repair and regeneration of the axon, so they actually can do some regeneration when we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. They also are going to have a myelinated and unmyelinated area, again with the white matter and the gray matter. And remember, this is the neural lemma, or the outer part of the cytoplasmic layer of the cell. Now, when these particular areas of the myelin are wrapped around, they form these little nodes or spaces in between that are called the nodes of Ranvier. These are gaps in the myelin sheath, and they're going to be important when we talk about how action potentials are sent. Now, myelination increases from birth to maturity, and this allows us to have better coordination and our axons to actually send these action potentials quicker and more easily without the use of as much ATP. Now, myelin is made out of a lipid and protein mixture. It is going to electrically insulate the axon, and it's going to increase the conduction rate of the nerve impulses. Now, we do see that when there's an issue with the myelin that covers these axons, if it's in the central nervous system, we see that this is known as multiple sclerosis or MS. This is an autoimmune disease where the oligodendrocytes are actually being destroyed by your immune system. This means that they can no longer make that myelin around there, and so it causes the nerves to short circuit. Okay, it starts to cause them to not be able to send their signals like they should. When we look at the peripheral nervous system, we see that when the immune system can attack these myelin sheaths in the peripheral nervous system, it's known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. However, in this case, they're not killing the Schwann cells, so the Schwann cells can continue to replace the myelin. So a lot of times patients can actually recover from their different symptoms or issues that they have with the Guillain-Barré syndrome.